Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman. I'm going to be your host for tonight's episode. And today we are discussing separation of church and state with David Pacheco like we did a month ago. But then when we talked mostly about past and present. And we're going to be talking kind of about the future, what's in store for 2016 in this episode. So welcome again, David.
Thank you very much.
So David is the president of the Minnesota chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I know you worked with training people on religious freedom issues, including the 2012 Minnesota United campaign to prevent marriage restrictions. And you've also done some church-state activities in California too, right?
I did that, yes. That was actually before starting Americans United while I was living there.
Right.
I lived in California for several years. So we did interact with a lot of separation issues there as well.
Okay, but you came here for the weather, and now you're here.
Came here for the beautiful, beautiful weather.
Yeah, so you definitely have the credentials. So yes. I have 5 things that you said we could discuss about the 2016 legislative agenda across the United States, and then I know a couple of others have just come on the radar since we last spoke, so we'll see how many we can...
Breaking news.
Yeah, so we'll see how many we can fit in the next 25 minutes or so here. So the first one that you mentioned was the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. Do you want to discuss what those are? And
Sure. The Religious Freedom Restoration Acts are extensions of a federal law that was passed over 20 years ago in response to some threats, and legitimate threats to religious freedom that occurred in that time. And in those cases, in the case of the federal law, what they were basically saying was we have to apply strict scrutiny to any issue that comes up that might go against religious freedom. And so the courts have various levels of scrutiny that they apply to laws, and some laws are just relatively common sense, and some laws require a lot of real scrutiny to say, is this a law that is passed to address a very, very specific government interest? And is it passed in a way that is the least restrictive way of accomplishing that goal? And so the RFRAs, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act laws, basically said that a lot of that religious objections to laws, if somebody raises that in the court of law, there has to be a strict scrutiny applied to it. And it worked rather well, and it addressed a lot of issues at the time. Unfortunately, people have taken advantage of it. And what is happening now is that there are a lot of states who are proposing bills that extend the RFRAs, so they're kind of state RFRAs. And they do the same thing, that they look at any state law or policy that's deemed to place what's called a substantial burden on the religious beliefs of a person. And the state has to prove that it has a compelling interest in the law, and that it is implementing the law in a very narrowly tailored way to fulfill that interest. So the problem is that now a lot of these laws are being used to strike down laws about discrimination or to deny women reproductive health care. So that's a huge problem, because these new RFRAs don't actually protect religious freedom.
so do you have an example of a case when a RFRA was used effectively for its intended purpose?
So the reason the RFRAs came up in the first place was to allow back then people to celebrate religious traditions that perhaps offended certain laws without necessarily harming anybody. And the case that actually drove the RFRAs had to do with the Department of Employment and people who had used peyote in a religious ceremony.
Oh, okay, sure.
And so that was, it caused a lot of controversy at the time, and so RFRA was passed with a significant majority in both houses, and with the support of groups like the ACLU at the time. And they were effective at preventing the government from imposing laws, even in some cases discrimination laws or employment laws, that really did not require that kind of legislation to protect somebody. So some of the things that are being allowed, cases that have been won over the past few years based on religious freedom and this kind of exemption, are things like wearing particular clothing. Can you fire somebody because they wear hijab? In the case of some clothing stores that had a very particular look that they wanted to give. Their employees had to look a certain way, and so they did not employ, or they would release or fire people who wanted to wear a hijab. And in those cases, or in a case from last year, where a prisoner in a federal prison wanted to grow out his beard to about 1.5 inches of length, and they were citing security issues because he wanted to grow his beard because of religious reasons. And in this particular state in Texas, they didn't want him to do that. And the argument was that it presented a security or a safety issue.
Sure.
Now that, in spite of the fact that people had hair on top of their heads that was far longer than that, and that other states did not have the same requirements, and yet did not descend into chaos. So it did actually allow for cases like that to come forth and protect religious freedom, protect people's rights to exercise their religious freedom. Because in the case of the inmate, for example, was there a compelling state interest in keeping that inmate's beard down to 1.5 inches? And it was decided that no, there really wasn't. If security was the issue, there are other ways to address it. In the same way that they address security of people having 1.5 inches or longer hair on top of their heads.
Are there any statistics on how much drugs he's been able to smuggle into the prison system with his beard?
I don't think so. They would have to be very, very short cigarettes, very short joints, in order to do that. So I don't think so.
So, but now you're saying this is eroding, or it could be eroding during this year?
Well, actually, what is happening is these laws are being, in a sense, strengthened, but in the wrong direction.
Okay.
So what is happening is people are proposing laws that affect a wide breadth of situations, and in some cases allow people to ignore other laws completely. They allow people to allow discrimination laws, to allow them to ignore healthcare laws, allow them to ignore the way they treat other people. And in fact, we have cases that have happened this very week that talk about how this might become really harmful over the course of the next few years if they are allowed to pass. And the really perfect example, I mean, this is fresh off the press, as they say, but in this week, there was a deputy county clerk for West Virginia and Gilmer County. She did her job. She gave a marriage license to a same-sex couple, as she is required to do by the law. However, she also heaped a pile of abuse on the couple. She said that what they were doing was wrong, that they were an abomination. She actually used that word to describe them. Now, this is a person who, if a RFRA law is passed in that state, allowing her to not provide services to people who offend her religious sensibilities, then that would be a couple that would have walked into a government office, had requested a marriage license, which everybody in the state has the right to go in and request, obviously if they're of age and are consenting adults. And they would have been rejected because of religious reasons, in the same way Kim Davis in Kentucky did. And it would have been perfectly legal. She would have been allowed to do that, and this couple would have been out of luck. If they couldn't find somebody whose religious sensibilities weren't offended, they would not have been able to get married. And marriage is such a fundamental right in this country. This is something that has been quoted multiple times in the Supreme Court in issues relating to marriage. It was even quoted as part of the recent Obergefell decisions that made same-sex marriage legal across the United States. It is such a fundamental right for achieving happiness, for achieving privacy, for having a happy life in the United States, that for somebody to say you don't deserve this because my religious sensibilities are offended by it is really problematic. To pass a law that will allow that to happen is of a huge concern.
And would they have to phrase the law really tightly so that it only applies to certain species of Christians who are offended by it, by same-sex marriage, and in order that they don't open up the door for someone of some fringe religion that is offended by people who wear glasses?
This is part of the problem. This is exactly part of the problem, that it does not define which religious beliefs should be preferred. And in that sense, it's a good thing, right? We don't want laws in this country saying we will establish preferential treatment for the believers of this particular religion or sub element of this religion. That's what you want. You want people to pass laws that are not in particular raising up or lowering down any individual religion. That's the principle of separation of church and state. But at the same time, the laws are written in a way that is so broad that it allows literally any religious belief. And the courts are very wary, especially the Supreme Court. They are very wary of defining what a religion is and what a valid belief is or not. And this is something we saw in the Hobby Lobby case. It wasn't the problem in the Hobby Lobby case was the fact that even though there were people who in this for-profit organization believed that some forms of contraception caused abortions, whether they were or not didn't actually matter. It only mattered that they believed, sincerely believed that that was the case. And that was enough for the courts to say, that's fine, that's your religious belief, we have to protect that. In spite of the fact that it allowed a company like Hobby Lobby to eliminate women's health care from their insurance plans. And so this is the real concern, that these laws are written in such a broad way that not only do they allow practically any belief that could be considered religious to be used as a reason to not follow a particular law, they don't specify even the nature of the laws. So it could be any law. It literally puts in danger any law in that state, because somebody could raise a religious objection to any law and say, I choose not to follow this because my religion opposes it. And the reason behind these laws in most cases tends to be against same-sex marriage, tends to be against non-discrimination laws, tends to be also against LGBT protections. So those are the things that they're focused on and the things they want to address. But they can't say that in the actual law. They can't say you are free to discriminate. You are free to not provide services to LGBT folks. But they can't say that. And the problem then becomes that they leave it completely open. And so an employer, a for-profit organization, can choose to say, it is against my religion to hire people of a certain race. It is against my religion to hire people of other religions. It is against my religion to hire people of any nationality that is not this particular set.
Yeah.
It leaves it completely open to allow that to happen, and it also allows, for example, a pharmacist to say, I am going to refuse HIV medication to you because I believe that your lifestyle is sinful, and I believe that this is a punishment that God has given you.
Sure. Well, clearly it is, otherwise they wouldn't have HIV.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So it opens the really Pandora's box in a lot of ways to allow for any law to go against. And where it really affects a lot of people is in things like women's health care and same-sex marriage and LGBT protections and discrimination lawsuits.
That kind of ties in with, that's the First Amendment Defense Act was the next item we had here. They sound pretty similar here.
Right, so they are very similar. The First Amendment Defense Acts tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused in that sense, because they not only do they allow government employees, the FADAs tend to be very specific towards government employees. Not only do they allow employers, government employees, to discriminate against same-sex couples or unmarried couples or people who have remarried, divorced and remarried, single mothers, those who have sex outside of marriage. In some cases, they actually require that discrimination to occur. And that one was particularly problematic. But as an example, some of these FADAs say are specific to wedding services. They responding to some of the lawsuits that have occurred in recent years against bakeries and florists that have refused to provide services to same-sex weddings. This would allow any organization to do so, to allow private businesses or individuals or government employees to refuse to provide wedding services. Today, it is not legal for a judge. If a judge decides that they want to perform marriages, not all judges and not all states require judges to perform marriages, but if they choose to do so, they have to marry anybody who requests it. They can't say, well, I'm only going to marry these particular couples because they are part of my religion or my race or whatever discrimination, nationality, age, any of the above. If these laws were passed, a judge could do that. They could definitely say, I am only going to marry opposite-sex couples. I am not going to provide that service to taxpayers who come to, before me and say,
this tax-funded group.
Your tax-funded employment, I would like to take advantage of this opportunity, and they can definitely say no. And the scarier ones are ones where they're actually trying to pass bills that provide penalties for recognizing marriages, same-sex marriages in this particular case. So these bills would require either firing or penalties or pay cuts to any government official or employee that follows the Constitution and follows the Supreme Court rulings and recognizes the marriage of same-sex couples. This is huge. This could be somebody saying at a state level, at the tax offices at a state level, saying, I do not recognize this couple as married. The same-sex couple, they filed as married. I do not recognize them as married, and so therefore, this tax filing is incorrect. It's illegal. It's in fact, you could expose that couple to a lawsuit or to a case saying you have forged government documents. You, well, not forged them, but you have lied on government documents. You signed your name down here. You said you were married, but you're not.
So what states are these pending in?
It depends on the state. So there's quite a few in South Carolina. There's Tennessee, Michigan, and Oklahoma have attempted or are attempting to pass laws that actually remove the state completely from the entire concept of marriage. You would no longer go before a judge. You would no longer get a marriage license from the court. You would have nothing to do with the government at all. It becomes almost a contract between two people, and the only way to recognize marriage at that point would actually be to go through a religious institution that performs those marriages, and those are recognized by the state, but otherwise the state removes itself completely. South Carolina and Tennessee have attempted to pass bills that do something very interesting, which is called nullification. Now, nullification is very problematic from a constitutional perspective, because what nullification attempts to do is to say this federal law does not apply to us at a state level. Now, the Constitution is very, very clear that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it is above any state law. However, there have been several attempts over the course of the past couple of hundred years where states have said, we choose to nullify this law. We do choose to not recognize this federal law. They never work, but it doesn't stop people from trying them. And it feeds a particular base of people who want to see that happen, who want to ignore the rules, ignore the laws at a federal level that they disagree with.
Does it happen in places besides South Carolina?
It does. Tennessee.
So that's the most surprising thing I've heard.
Well, Tennessee was definitely one of them, and Kentucky has been talking about doing it too. But there are other states. Florida even has passed, or has not passed yet, but is attempting to pass laws that would allow adoption agencies to discriminate against same-sex couples or against single mothers, single fathers, any kind of combination of household that a particular religious organization does not like, while still receiving taxpayer funding if they're a private company or a nonprofit organization, or as part of government officials themselves.
So we kind of touched on a couple of these. Let's move on to student group bills. You talked about that would bar colleges and universities from enforcing non-discrimination policies that applies to student religious clubs. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so public schools, public colleges cannot discriminate, cannot allow that taxpayer money to be used to discriminate against groups of students. So a lot of these colleges and universities, they often have these non-discrimination policies. And what this is for groups that are organized by the students themselves. And what they require is that any student group has to allow students to join in and to participate and to seek leadership in these groups. And they cannot discriminate. They cannot say, no, we only allow people of this race or people of this nationality. Now, these policies ensure that these public colleges and universities don't subsidize discrimination. Now, there was a case in 2010, which was the Christian Legal Society versus Martinez. The Supreme Court upheld this policy, this college policy, against the claims that it violated constitutional rights of a Christian student club in that case. Now, in response to that case, many state legislatures, including Kansas and Missouri, have considered bills that would forbid colleges and universities from enforcing these policies, and or that would exempt particular religious clubs from doing so. So it's again in this guise of religious freedom. So they would exempt them from these non-discrimination rules. Now, of course, Americans United opposes these rules because they force state schools, taxpayer-funded state schools, to sanction discrimination against protected groups.
So why would a club want to discriminate? I mean, if I start a Christian club at a public college, Would I maybe like not want a Buddhist to join in because I'm afraid they might infiltrate or
They might-
rabble rouse or something?
They
I
might
mean, what's
rabble
the-
rouse. They might cause problems and ask the wrong questions and cause people to question their beliefs. And in the cases of private organizations, you are free to do that as long as you're not accepting taxpayer money. You are free to say this is a private organization and we only allow people of this religion.
Right.
Even groups like the Boy Scouts, to a certain degree, only allow members who are religious, who have made a proclamation of faith of some sort, at least until very recently. But private organizations can do this. They can discriminate. However, companies for employment cannot. And any organization that accepts taxpayer money cannot. So, and any group that is a government organization cannot do that. So, a government organization cannot say we will only hire people of this race, people of this religion.
Okay.
And so, what these bills, these proposed bills, will do is they will bar these public schools, public colleges and universities from enforcing these non-discrimination policies.
Okay.
Meaning that. And if you're at a state university, you can form this group and you can specifically reject people because of their religious beliefs or their race or their nationality. Or
Okay, so really any
of the
metric that they feel is offensive.
Any of the protected. So where we are concerned is in the protected groups,
Okay,
the ones
sure.
that are protected by discrimination laws, and that includes gender, it includes age, religion, nationality, whether somebody is pregnant or not. All kinds of different rules, and some states have protections for LGBT folks, some do not. There's a large number of states still in the United States where you can be fired for being gay, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no protection for it. There have been some proposals, the ENDA, the Employee Non-Discrimination Act, which has been proposed for several years now. It has never really gone anywhere at the federal level, but we keep bringing it back because we think it's a good thing. But that would require non-discrimination against LGBT folks for employment across the United States. And that would kind of smooth things out because right now it's very variable. You can get married in one state and be protected. You can move to another state and your job is not really secure because if your employer finds out that you're gay, they can fire you.
So I think we covered pretty much everything that we listed here, but you said that there were a couple of things brand new that just came onto your radar that you wanted to talk about.
Yes, well, one of them was this deputy county clerk in West Virginia who heaped abuse, as I said, on this couple that came in to get a marriage license. Now, if the RFRA in West Virginia were to pass, then she would have the freedom to reject services.
Is it possible this clerk just does this to every couple that comes in?
It's entirely possible that she thinks marriage in general is an abomination. Maybe she's had some bad experiences and has forsaken love and marriage and chooses to impose that on everybody else too. I doubt that's the case, especially in West Virginia. But the problem is that West Virginia actually this week as well voted, the House of Delegates voted 72-26, a very lopsided vote, to pass a bill that legalized discrimination against LGBT citizens on the basis of sincerely held religious belief. And this is what we look for, by the way, in these RFRAs. They always reference this sincerely held religious belief. It's a touchstone for these laws precisely because the court says we're going to take a hands-off approach to this. We cannot define what a sincerely held religious belief is or not.
That's a very fuzzy
So
term.
if you say it is, we're going to take you at your word, but that allows you to say anything you want. So, and surprisingly, about 8 Democrats crossed party lines to vote with the GOP majority on that one, and I believe all the GOP members voted to pass this bill. So it moves to the state Senate now. The Republicans in West Virginia have a 2-seat majority. We'll see what happens there. But it's this kind of law is being proposed. These bills are being put forth in many, many states. They are very, very problematic, written in a very broad way. The implications and the unintended results of these laws are really problematic. And so we're keeping our eyes on them to say, let's fight back against these. Let's make sure that everybody is aware of what's happening. Let's make sure that some of these riders don't get introduced at the last second in other bills and transportation bills and things like that.
So we have a few minutes left. What are a couple ways that you do make the public knowledgeable about it or fight back against it?
So we hear from our members, and we hear a lot from the national organization, The national organization actually was the one who let us know about the issue in Wadena here about a nativity scene that was
Oh, right, yeah, we
put up.
talked about
that last
time.
time. So our members and the members of AU National are the best sources of this kind of information. We can't attend every legislative meeting in every small town. And what we do then is we publicize these positions, these statements, these bills. Americans United has obviously their website. They have their Protect Your Neighbor initiative, which publicizes these things and allows you to look state by state to see where these things are happening, where they're being proposed, and what you can do about them, who you can contact, and things like that. Fortunately, Minnesota only really has one rule right now, or one proposed bill, which is about marriage, allowing government contractors and for-profit businesses to discriminate against same-sex couples. So we only have one, which is fortunate. But we like to keep everybody informed of what's happening in the rest of the country as well.
So when you say it's pending, you mean it's currently in committee yet?
Currently they are in committee, or they're being reviewed by committee. There is another one that was recently brought up regarding, I think it was called the Beating Heart Bill, which for religious reasons allows people to be accused of a felony if they perform an abortion.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So there are related bills that are being proposed as well. This one is the one that's really specifically separation of church and state problematic, I would say.
So if people want to learn more or get involved, Americans United's website is au.org.
Yep.
Is there any other websites?
Our local website for the Minnesota chapter, mnau.org.
Okay. So you're going to have to come back next year because we'll have a turnover with some of our representatives, governors, legislators. Of course, Obama will be given the keys to Ben Carson. So we'll have to talk again like in a year and see what's going on. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us about the year and what's going on in the government with the legislatures around the country.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for paying attention to our show, for watching us, for listening to us online. If you'd like to learn more about Minnesota Atheists, you can go ahead and contact the information that you see on the screen. We put up our address, phone number, email address. If you do get in touch with us, we'll be happy to send you a free copy of our newsletter so that you can learn more about us. And if you'd like to see any things presented here on the show, just let us know. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you.